It's okay. And we are recording. Hey, Borboleta, how's it going?
Pretty good. How are you?
I'm okay. Thank you for agreeing to do this video series. So this video series is highlighting anti-racist capoeira instruction with the intent to archive and amplify the work that instructors are already doing and potentially provide a path forward for people who are interested in doing more intentional capoeira work. Can you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Borboleta. I'm currently located in Texas. My capoeira school is Filhos de Bimbo, which is based in Salvador, Bahia. And within the school, I'm considered a professora, which means that I teach and that I'm responsible for my own students. We don't use a ranking system or a cord system, so it works a little bit differently there. But I had my formatura in December of 2018, and I've been teaching here in Texas since 2014, and I've run my own, kind of been responsible for my own group since 2010. So I've been teaching in capoeira for a long time. I've been in capoeira for, I think, 18 years now. So it's, yeah, I know it's been a minute. And it, continues to take, I continue to learn through it and to learn about it, and to find all of the ways that it affects my life in really positive ways, and brings me so many opportunities. And that's one of the reasons why, I continue to work to make sure that I'm able to share it with others, because it has given me so much.
Yeah, and you have academic background as well, right?
I do. I'm a PhD in comparative literature, which just means I've read a lot of books. I was in my second year of graduate school when I first came into capoeira, so those two are kind of linked for me in a lot of ways. My research in particular was on the violent resistance on the part of enslaved peoples to the systems of slavery, in particular in the Caribbean, and the ways in which those moments of resistance and rebellion are sometimes memorialized in history. For example, in Haiti, where it becomes a very powerful and proudful part of history, and in other places are really erased, such as in the Dominican Republic, which is, the neighboring country of the same island. And then, all sorts of different approaches to that in other islands in the Caribbean as well. So the research kind of started in the lead up to the Haitian Revolution, and looked at 20th century representations of history, rewritings of history, both in the positive and the negative, in relationship to the enslaved expressing themselves, and the way that those expressions, kind of manifest in modern day society. And so, of course, that meshed really well with what I was learning about capoeira at the same time.
And it's rough for all of us that are conscious of American history, but I imagine that is especially hard when you have done all this work, when you see people be like, violence has no place in a protest, in a revolution. We should ask nicely, and the oppressors will give us what we want. That is an aside. That's not part of the focus of the interview. That's just something that I feel like every time I see a Facebook comment with something like that, I'm like, oh, Borboleta is going to die when she sees this.
It's a very limited viewpoint for sure. But I think, memes are good at rebuttals. So there's been plenty of, what about the Boston Tea Party? What about the American Revolution? So, I really try not to get engaged on that stuff in Facebook, because I don't find that is the place where my energy and my voice are best used.
The place that your energy and voice are best used, though, you have a relationship with the Fort Worth ISD, and you've done programming related to capoeira through there. You've also been very intentional in like how you present that programming, which may diverge a little bit from how we traditionally see capoeira presented in education settings. Can you get a little bit into that?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I've been really lucky to have all of these opportunities in Fort Worth to work with the city and with the schools. And you know, when I moved out here, I didn't know anybody. I did a bunch of cold calls. I was like, hey, I know you don't know how to say this thing, but let me teach it to the children that you work with. And you know, for whatever reasons, people listened to me, and so I was able to start. You know, there wasn't previously capoeira in Fort Worth, like in an official kind of capacity, and so there was a lot of education that had to happen before, you know, before I could get students in any sort of way. And so, you know, I was lucky that people were interested and that people listened. And I've actually been invited now every year since its inception, which was, I think, 3 years ago now. Fort Worth ISD now has an annual Multicultural Institute, which is a Saturday all-day programming that they do for their teachers, primarily teachers in the social sciences, but not only. It, you know, they have some guest speakers, but then they also have a lot of breakout sessions, and it's all about bringing and identifying and thinking through multicultural pedagogy. And so what I have done with that, and it's something that I've kind of developed with each time that I've been there is, you know, I walk in with my wagon full of instruments, and you know, and then I end up with a room full of teachers who have, you know, they're halfway through their semester, and they're there on a Saturday, and they've already, you know, maybe been to a few hours of programming, and they're like, sweet, we're gonna sit here and watch some people do cartwheels. That'll be fun, right? Or listen to some music, or, you know, whatever. But I go through the instruments and I start to, you know, introduce them and what they are and where they're from and how they're made and how they make sound, and I start passing them out. And I do this until everybody's got an instrument. And then, you know, at that point, everybody kind of knows what they're called and knows a little bit about how they make noise. We do this, I have cachixis, I have agogos, I have shekere, I've got panderos, I've got drums that I bring in as well. And so depending on the number of people there, I don't let them touch my berimbau's. But, you know, I can usually get up to 35 people all holding an instrument. And then I'm like, okay, make noise, you know. And it's already always a fight because they come in and they like kind of try to go back and sit behind desks. And they're as bad as my students in academic classes. They're like sitting at the back and pulling out their phones, and I'm like, no, you got to come up here. Like you need to grab one of these. We're gonna all be in this together. And you can see in their faces that that's not, you know, not really why they came. But so then they all they grab an instrument, they start making it. Some people are super timid. Other people are like, you know, bah, 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 bah. It sounds terrible.
Yeah.
But that's to be expected, right? And so we do that for a minute, and then I'm like, all right, cool. What do you think? And they're like, that sounds terrible, right? And then I'm like, okay, well, let's see what happens if we organize it a little bit. And so we make an orchestra, and we put all of the cachixis together and all the panderos together, which panderos wouldn't normally really go into that, but just depends on how many people I have. All the shekeres, all the agogos, etc. And then we start, I divide each section, and I give each section, you know, a base to work from. And we usually work with something pretty simple like Ijesha that has a few different parts, so it's still polyrhythmic, but it isn't too hard and too repetitive. And really, in just a minute, I can get them all playing together and playing a rhythm that sounds really good. And it's a kind of amazing experience for everybody involved, including for me. Every time that it works, I'm like, oh wow, yay, it worked. But what I use that to talk about as a start, and like I said, I do this with these teachers. I also do it with little kids. But it is to think about the way that working together doesn't have to be hard. but we can do so much more when we work together. And capoeira, for me, it's a communal expression, it's a popular expression, it's an expression of people. And all community dance, all communal dance forms, all kind of cultural dance forms are meant to bring community together. And so they are meant for both the little babies to be able to participate in and the oldest people to be able to participate in, for the most amazing athletes to be able to participate in, and for the people who don't have that same mobility to be able to participate in. And it's meant to bring everyone together so that we can be stronger together. And it's you know, that I have a lot of reasons why I do it this way. One thing for me, like as a pedagogical tool, I think it's really.
Can we define the word pedagogy real quick if we have people who don't have academic background?
Yeah, no, as a kind of as the science of teaching, right? And as a way to teach effectively, and that, but also that is multifaceted, right? Because there are people who learn easier through hearing things and through reading things and through physically doing things and from watching things. There's all these different forms of learning, and so you want to hit kind of as many of those as you can. And so, you know, when I'm looking at this, I really want it to be participatory. I want people not to just watch. And we're in a society where it's really easy to watch, and we have all this technology, and you can just watch a documentary on that and watch a YouTube video on this. But watching doesn't guarantee engagement, and it doesn't guarantee conversation. And I think especially when and this is why I do this at this multicultural institute, you know, for teachers, is I want them to think about ways in which they can let their students experience rather than just be entertained by. I think that we create distance rather than closeness when we just watch a video of something foreign, rather than finding ways. And obviously, like, not everybody has the tools to be able, you know, you can't, on your segment of French history, you don't necessarily get to bring in, you know, people from France to make your crepes or whatever, you know. But wherever possible, when we can bring in authentic voices, then we can, and when we can experience, even on a very marginal way, what happens, it becomes less of a show. And I think especially when we're talking about cultural movement and when it's related to music, it very quickly becomes a show.
Yeah.
And more of an experience that you can, you know, you're not going to get the meaning of it in 15 minutes or in 30 minutes, or maybe even in, you know, a year. But you do start to feel something which will be engaging for you in other ways.
And that goes in general. So you have the Multicultural Institute that you do at the school, but you also have very deliberate framing from this viewpoint that's in your classes. So if I show up to your class and I'm a beginner and I'm like, teach me how to flip, teach me how to do cool movements. Like, how does it look? How does somebody's first day in your class look?
Yeah, so I'm really lucky in that I work with Capoeira Regional in the lineage of Mestre Bimba. And Mestre Bimba was this amazing pedagogue, really. And he created both a philosophy. He didn't create, he defined for himself the philosophy that he would use for Capoeira Regional. And he created also a methodology for teaching Capoeira Regional. And when we in Filhos de Bimba talk about what is Capoeira Regional, we're not talking about movement or even necessarily rhythm, although rhythm is a big piece of this, but we're talking about this methodology and this philosophy. And part of his methodology, you know, is a very specific way of teaching, and it has a start and it has maybe not an end, but it has a trajectory. And this methodology and this trajectory is something that Mestre Nenel, Mestre Bimba's son and my teacher, has continued to develop, and is what he uses now and passes down to us, his teachers. And so it makes it really, really easy in a lot of ways to know where to start.
Yeah.
So I actually, I don't offer, a free trial at my studio. You don't get your first class free or your first week free. And I don't even allow people to just come in and watch our classes. Some of that are practical reasons. I don't have a receptionist. My space is very small. I'm responsible for everybody in the room. And so if I've got a stranger in the room, then that changes where my attention is. I also don't feel like it's fair for my students who may not want to be watched to suddenly become like the object of being watched. And also my classes are tailored to who comes to class that day. And so somebody who comes in and watches is not necessarily going to get any idea of what class will be like for them if they're in it. But instead I have people who are interested in becoming students sign up for an intro class. And we schedule that, and it's a private class to semi-private class. Sometimes we'll have 2 or 3 people in it. And in that class, we go over the history of capoeira. We go over some of the philosophy and methodologies of capoeira regional. And we go over some really basic movements so that they have a vocabulary and an awareness of what to expect. And of course, then they're still going to be beginners when they walk into that first class, but they'll have at least heard these things, and it allows my regular classes to move smoothly.
Mm-hmm. I think that does happen. I like that model a lot, because a lot of times when beginners come to classes, if you haven't had the intro, you don't catch anything but the movement. You're like, well, there's that music in the background and it's so nice. And like, you don't have like the intentional framing of the art to like even proceed into the room with. And so with community being such a big aspect of your class, with everybody having to get involved, with everybody feeling and experiencing something when they participate in this, we can't help but like draw some parallels to a kind of community engagement that people are experiencing for the first time with protests right now. What is a protest? A protest is a community and movement and an action with a goal, And in our pre-interview, we talked about some really interesting connections between protest chants and the capoeira songs and the functionality of those in both of these spaces. Can you compare and contrast those a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I've had the opportunity to march in several protests here in Fort Worth in these past few weeks. And I say opportunity because I know that not everybody, like that's not everybody's form of engagement, and that is great. But for me, it's something that, for one thing, is somewhat familiar to me, and that is, again, because community is so important for me to be there and to join my voice with other people's voices, to add my body to this mass of bodies is important. But it has been interesting, and I've also been able to bring some of my capoeira students as well with me. But it's interesting, as we march and as we walk, we're all chanting together. And there's a call, right? There's a leader, and then there's a response. And all I can think about in these last 2 weeks in these chants is its relationship to the corridos of capoeira. Because there's, and this is something I talk about in my classes regularly, and especially maybe with my little kids when I'm in after school programs, but, why do we sing? And why is it important to sing in capoeira? I haven't read on this, but I believe, based on my experience, kind of with people, but also with diasporic arts, is that singing is a way to build community. And it's not about singing beautifully, right? But it's about putting your energy into a place with everybody else's energy. So going back to the Multicultural Institute that I do with the teachers, I get them all doing a rhythm. I also get them all singing. And it's something that I find that maybe more so in the United States, but people are really scared to sing. Yeah. And I get that, it's a foreign language, and it's, people are looking at you, and we're so used to leaving things to professionals. We're so afraid of criticism that we're very it's very hard to get people, and especially to get adults, to do things where they feel like where they're self-critical, right? Um, and, and so when we can create a space where everyone isn't worried about what they're doing, but they're worried about what the group is doing, or not worried about, but they're becoming something with the group. And so when people realize it's not about me, it's about this space and this energy right now. And I think that that's what singing does in capoeira, just the way if you go to church, it does it in church. It puts people on the same plane, right? It puts their energy all together. And so in these marches and these protests, if you're with 200 people, or if you're with 2,000 people, to have all of those voices reverberating with that same energy, it's really powerful. Because it kind of go hand in hand between a beginner learning how to lead songs and then listening to people lead these protests, because there's breath work, right? There's energy. They're saving your voice, but still being loud and projecting. There's also the ability to transition from one song to the next. And there's a tendency, especially when you're new in capoeira and in protests, I think, to feel like you need to change your song all the time, right? When I think that corridos, and this is something that I've heard said by kind of the elders of capoeira as well, it's meant to almost create a trance, right? And so you want to have that same corrido and just draw it out. And the only reason you're going to change it is to change the energy in the roda, right? Because the game has changed, so you need to respond to that. Or maybe if two different people are coming in, or maybe the energy started to drop, so you have to change the song to bring a new song in. The songs in capoeira should be very strategic in that sense. And I think in the same way, that's something that can help in these protests, if people think strategically about the way that they're chanting, the way that they're linking chants, the way that they're engaging people, and even the way that they pass chants, right? We all know in the roda that dead time when nobody's singing is like, right?
Yeah.
And the same thing happens in the protests, right? If there's, somebody gets tired and somebody's not ready to jump in, and, obviously there's not an orchestra where you can just kind of make the eye contact, but I think it's a really interesting parallel. And I think that, and we look at the history of singing in labor as well, right? Puxar de rede. Why do we sing in puxar de rede? Well, you're dragging this giant net that weighs hundreds or thousands of pounds. I don't know, what weighs a lot, right? And you're working in a group, and what's going to help that whole group work together but a steady beat, right? And what makes it less heavy but singing something happy together. I used to actually make the comparison of this singing to chain games, but I've realized also that this is it's a deep African tradition of labor and of free labor, right? So shame on me for letting that history start in slavery, but at least I'm learning and recognizing kind of that if we go further back, we can see that there are things, there are ways in which slavery and that system, we're about to be joined by a cat, but there are ways in which slavery and that system, did create the means for certain forms of expression, but none of those expressions started because of slavery. Or started out of slavery. Slavery is not the start. Slavery is just a moment in something, in a lifespan, in a cultural span that started long before that, and that brings all of this memory and all of this richness along with it.
That's something that you've personally challenged me on, and I am very grateful for, because when talking about, capoeira, like I definitely fell into the framing of something that began with slavery. And it's like, no, it was a catalyst for this particular form of expression, but the tools and the ingredients were already there. And I also think that it's just so interesting when we think about these traditions have shown up in diasporic populations, like in the Caribbean, in North America, in Brazil. We see these like chants and these, this is type of musical expression in all of these forms. And I'm only really thinking about it now, but I'm almost thinking about kind of the subvert racism that comes with thinking that people just like just started this, you know, just cause we just like songs, you know, whereas like this music has function. And in a lot of ways, this is being part of this community is access to like ancestral knowledge that people wouldn't have access to. Going back to what you said about watching a video about slavery is not the same as being in a group with a purpose, seeing how that music affects your body, affects your energy, affects yourself. And I just think that that was a really cool connection with that. And you know, and that especially goes into this idea, you can't really have capoeira without community. And can you just speak a little bit? We've heard it a little in the interview so far, but can we really hone in on the importance of community in your capoeira practice in your groups?
Yeah. You know, we all know, probably, if we work in capoeira, we've all heard the story that capoeira was developed because slaves were trying to defend themselves, but they needed to hide, you know, the fighting, that they were practicing fighting, and so they disguised it with music and as dance. And I think that that story is really, for one thing, when we talk about history, and especially history of the subaltern, of the oppressed, of minorities, of the enslaved peoples, we don't necessarily have a truth and a non-truth, because history, you know, that was not the history that was recorded in the way that, at least here in the West, that we consider history to have been, to be made, right? And that's another discussion. You know, why is it that we care about the written history more than the oral history or the experiential history, or, you know, those things? But that idea has led us to some of these stories that I think, if we think critically about them, we can find a lot of holes in them. And it's again, it's not something, you know, I think each of these stories serves their purpose, so not to take away from that. But when we think critically about the experience of slavery, we know, for one thing, that there are hierarchies built within the slave system. And so, you know, within these tiers, many of the people who have authority are still from the same families as, can we pause? All right, sorry about that. Yeah, so, you know, slavery had, the system of slavery in and of itself had tiers of hierarchy. And many times, you know, there in these tiers, you know, we have several tiers of people who are from the same house as the mass of people who have been enslaved, right? And so there's no hiding from them what is happening. They're part of this tradition already. This story that you know, that it's just that it's a fight that's been disguised as a dance, and that has the music with it, I very much believe is the story of white people, slave masters, whatever, right? Slave owners, of plantation owners, looking in on these rituals and not understanding them. But I think that that lack of understanding is not because it was hidden, but because they didn't care. And we can see this also. Messi Cobra Mansa has a documentary called Jogo de Corpo. I think it came out maybe in 2014 or something. And I believe it's actually available for free on Vimeo now. But it's great, and you should definitely watch it. But it traces capoeira back to Western Africa, where we see, you know, so many rituals that are martial in aspect, that are done with music, that are done to people in a circle of many people. We see all of these spaces where the beat and bow is used. And then not only that, if we look at diasporic arts, we can look at cumbia, we can look at salsa casino, salsa rueda, right? We can see this idea of a circle and with multiple people and with music. And this is a natural form of expression that is, you know, we talk about capoeira as these roots in Africa, or a seed from Africa, but that was planted in Brazil. And we can see that when we start the story of capoeira with slavery, we cut off this entire lineage, this entire history. We have to understand, and I think part of the thing is that we don't know how to talk about slavery, and we don't know how to talk about the creation of the slave. And what slavery was, what slavery did and does, because we can't say that it's over. If we look at the prison system, we will see the exact same thing. But it is an erasure of identity, and it's an erasure of citizenship, right? And so it is worse than death because it is a social death. And then in the crazy instance of the Americas, it's also an inherited situation, right? And slavery is something that has existed for all time, but it is not until we get into the racialized slavery in the Americas that it is something that is generational. But what slavery is it is these oppressive powers doing everything they can to erase the humanity of these enslaved peoples. And something like capoeira is an exact refusal to have your identity erased, because your identity does not start at slavery. Slavery is simply the situation that you as a person have been thrown into. And your entire cultural history and cultural memory, whether that's your memory or generational memory that's been passed down to you, is not something that is the result of slavery. The slavery is an institution that you are stuck in, but your refusal to be defined by that is your ability to still sing and to still dance and to still play instruments and to still form a community that has these bonds that are so strong. And so when we talk about capoeira, we do talk about community, because why do we have music in capoeira? Like, why do we have singing in capoeira? Why do we have rhythm in capoeira? And it's because and again, we can see this not just in capoeira, but in cultural expression throughout the world. It is a way to create a communal identity. And I think it is very, very important that we do not rob the culture of this meaning. And as soon as we just start to teach flips or fast kicks or whatever, not that those aren't a beautiful part of capoeira, but they are a small piece of it, right? And so I try and frame that very clearly from the very first moment that somebody enters into my class or that I'm invited into somebody else's classroom. And so that goes back to this whole idea that we're not there to dance for you. We're there for you to experience something with us so that you can see this deep history, this deep culture, this deep beauty as something that is life-saving, and that is identity-saving.
Just hearing you talk about that, a comparison that I can't help but make is to like American hip hop and this idea of, you know, people of privilege, people that don't want to invest, some white people, in the cultural expression and understanding the context of hip hop, and then come in and just take the pieces that benefit them. Iggy Azalea, hip hop dance classes led by somebody, you know, in the suburbs that's never been exposed to actual hip hop culture. Like, just this idea that you can extract a piece, and just the devaluement of Black artistic labor when we think that, oh, they just happen to do this way, and that, you know, that racism manifests in a lot of ways. And I've said repeatedly, racism is not just calling somebody a slur, but the devaluement of Black tradition and Black labor, those are also ways that like racism manifests itself. And so I kept thinking of that, the connection between how we even treat Black created and owned arts in America. Going back to what you said about, you mentioned about if you do a show that it's not there to be consumed. That's a very intentional framing, and that's almost like a bold statement to say. Can you get into that and then maybe pair it with an example of what a show looks like that you host in the community?
Yeah, and I, you know, there's a lot of different. Again, I have through my different experiences, I've learned how I've put a frame around it, but it's not necessarily where I started. I may have started this way because I was by myself and I didn't have anyone else there, you know, but it has definitely become something that is very intentional for me. So I consider what I do here to be a cultural school. And we, you know, we teach movement and these things, but it's still a school. And you learn in school, you learn anything through repetition and through an engagement and through through dedication to that thing, right? And so what I find to be most rewarding for me is to know that people are going to walk away from their hour with me, whether it's in a school or in a library or even at a city event, having experienced something. I'm not there to have a video taken that's going to end up on YouTube, or for people to say, you know, to be like, wow. And that's for a number of different reasons. For one thing, like from a business aspect, most people see people doing backflips and they're not like, oh yeah, I could do that. How do I sign up? You know, so there's that part, but that also goes back to the community aspect of it, where it's not about the exceptional individual, but it is about the way that everyone can be included in something. And at the same time, it's not about watching, it's about doing. And so I'm always going to get instruments into as many people's hands as I can. I'm always going to have people clapping out a few different rhythms. I'm always going to be teaching people a few words in Portuguese at least, and then putting those into song. You know, and then we get into some movement where it's like, yeah, I try to go through a few different moves with people, and I have some different variations for, you know, who feels like they can go all the way down to the ground and stand back up, and who says that is not going to happen today, either because my body says no or my clothing says no, which are both, you know, very likely scenarios depending on where I am. But I want people to experience, because I believe that, you know, we talked about these different ways of learning, but I believe that a very real way of learning is through corporeal experience, is through actually going through movements, is through using your body. And we think about learning as a thing that is done in our brain. And when we talk about reading or speaking or listening, we're generally talking about, you know, we still are thinking from the neck up. But I think that so much of learning as well, we forget that the head is a part of the body, in the same way that we forget that the body is a part of the head. And so, you know, for our brain to function, our body has to function. For our body to function, our brain has to function. And of course, I'm saying that in a relative way, right? But the more that you can feel things with your whole body, which again, going back to music and going back to singing, vibration, right, that touches you in your heart, then the more that you can process, I believe, you know, kind of what it is. Because I can sit up, I can go anywhere and I can speak for an hour and people are going to be like, wow, she said a lot of things. In the same way, I can go and I can do a show and people will be like, wow, that was cool. And they walk away, right? But when somebody actually starts to move with it, right? And again, this is the genius of music and percussion as a community expression, is that it touches everyone. Even the hard of hearing, percussive is vibration. You know, it doesn't have to be melody, right? Percussion is what you're seeing and how you fall into what you see as well. There are so many ways to feel this that don't take just one sensation, and that I truly believe are just really inclusive. And I'm sure we can find examples where it's not inclusive, but I think that the true intent is inclusivity on every level.
Yeah, that's as somebody with a disability, that's something that capoeira has always struck me as, is that there's so many points of entry for people of all different types of bodies. I'm thinking about how, like, you know, deaf music from people in deaf culture is very focused on percussion because of the vibrations, and it's like, wow, that's just another group of people that can enjoy capoeira if it's presented its entirety. And so I wanted to talk about your mestre has
Well,
some.
I do want to say that that's a big piece of it, though, is that, you know, obviously not everybody knows how to teach it from that space, because if you are somebody who learned just movement, then that's what you're going to teach. And you know, that's, the movement's a part of it. But then again, it becomes to who is coming into your classroom and who's staying in your classroom, who's actually being able to be touched by what you're giving. Sorry.
No, thank you. But I think that all of that kind of goes to, you mentioned briefly the business aspect of it, and your mestre has some very deliberate choices that he's made for himself that have translated into your work as his student around the financial aspects and the way that capoeiristas should consider the role of like finances in their capoeira practice. You know, and this is going to be kind of a controversial statement, but people who are in positions of financial desperation and the only skills that they are able to market are often put into positions where they're forced to make unfortunate choices in their presentation of capoeira. I think that this is a big reason why we've seen the rise of capoeira fit classes, where it's quite literally just the movement. And then when you look at it, it's like, well, somebody was put in a position where they had to present it in that way because of, reasons. And so can you speak a little to your mestre's stance on all of this?
Mestre Nenel and the school that he's created, Filhos de Bimba, it is about, it's I would have to go to the Fundação's page to know the exact mission statement, but it is, it is about preserving and developing traditions and rituals and history in a sense. And so, given that is, and there's also something that's really beautiful about Capoeira Regional and Capoeira Regional, the way it has been taught to me by Mestre Nenel, which is that, like, it is enough in itself. So we don't need bells and whistles, which, I mean, maybe other people aren't putting bells and whistles on it, but like, we can just do, we don't need anything else but what we have learned for that to be enough. And that goes back into like this idea of shows, and what's, if it needs to be kind of flashier or prettier or more eye-catching, when what we have already is, I believe, is enough, and my mestre believes that it is enough. And he has said on several occasions, I wouldn't go so far as to like put this into, it's something that I've heard him say on multiple occasions, is that he does make his living, Mr. Nenel does make his living off of capoeira, but it's not something that he would wish on any of his students, because he truly believes that capoeira should be there to enrich lives as opposed to being someone's life. And so, not that your hard work shouldn't be compensated, but if capoeira is everything to you, then that limits you greatly. Whereas if capoeira is a complement to what you do, we think about it this even goes back to this idea about thinking about it in community. It has to fit into a whole. And, you know, I'm very lucky in that I have, I'm lucky or not lucky, that I have 16 jobs. No, but that I do have other forms of income. And I have rearranged my life again and again to make capoeira. And I say capoeira, but this kind of Brazilian cultural arts, right, to be a larger and larger priority in my life. Both because, like I said, of everything it gives to me, but because I also have these opportunities to share this in meaningful ways with my community. And I think that the value of that is not even something that we can capture, right? Because of the ways that it can involve everyone, because of the ways that it, you know, kind of these inherent philosophies, which we can say are inherent West African philosophies, right? Of inclusion, of community, of expression, of heritage, that are passed in these things. They are things that everyone benefits from. But also, it has meant for me that I'm able to, because it's not my primary form of, or my only form, I guess I would say, of financial compensation, that I, you know, I'm able to do it the way that I think is right. Because I don't have to do it in any one way, if that makes sense.
No, it does make sense. Yeah, so that is almost the end of our time. Before we go, thank you again so much for doing this. Can you just shout out, you are doing a lot of online stuff right now that people can get cued into if they want to learn more about you, learn more about the work that you do. So can you just shout out some of the work that you are doing?
Yeah, so the capoeira that I do is part of Filhos de Bimba. And Filhos de Bimba is located inside of kind of an umbrella that I've created called On This Community. Through On This, On This is what allows me to do more than just capoeira in a lot of ways. And so we have a virtual dance series that we started at the beginning of the pandemic, and we're not sure how long it'll go on, but you know, it's at least through the end of June and probably into July. And in these past weeks, since the passing of the murder of George Floyd, we've also, you know, originally I started it with the pandemic as a way to continue to support artists and the arts. I had my main event was supposed to happen in April, and I had contracted people to come in for that, and then I had to cancel those contracts, and I felt really bad. You know, people depend on those monies. And so I was like, well, why don't I still do this virtually? And that way I can still support my friends and support the arts in that way, and also keep my studio open. But since in these past few weeks, we have been finding organizations in the hometowns of the instructors to donate to. And so, you know, each week we're donating at least 50% of what we bring in to justice organizations in the hometowns of our instructors. So that's been a really cool thing. We also offer Portuguese classes online, which I think, again, if you're going to invest in capoeira, then you have to look at all of the pieces of it, which you were only going to be able to do if you invest in your Portuguese as well. And then On This Community has also run a book club for several years now that has focused on writings primarily by women of color. You know, it's not something that I've used the term anti-racist for, because it's I didn't feel the need to say it. But if you look at our book list, it's absolutely an anti-racist book list. And it's, you know, we've covered things like Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, and Just Mercy, which was recently made into a movie. Currently we're reading Angela Davis. So these are all very salient themes right now. And so everyone is invited, obviously, to check those out. It's onthiscommunity.com.
Awesome. Yeah, and I like the idea of people hopping in on that book club because we've seen so many just spring up out of nowhere and generally they're organized around like, we got to do something. Let's read a book, you know. But yours has been there and it's been established. You know, racism didn't start with George Floyd's murder, and it's not going to end when the protests stop either. So I just want to emphasize that getting cued into to communities that have done this ongoing work is incredibly important in this moment. It's great that we have all these things popping up, but there are people of color, especially Black people, especially Black women, that have been doing this forever. So I just wanted to do that one shout out. And then just for this series, if you like what you're seeing here and would like to collaborate, please do. I have quite a few more speakers coming up that I'm really excited about. I'm also very intentional about paying folks. So if you would like to keep seeing these, please consider making a donation to the GoFundMe, as my stimulus check is only going to get us so far. I also
You still have any?
huh?
Is it? I'm impressed you still have any.
Girl, I'm $700 into this shit. Sorry, this thing. Sorry. Whew. Anyway, that being said, people do seem to be liking this. Each video is getting a minimum of 500 views. I am looking for a woman of color, a capoeirista with maybe some journalism experience. I'm defining that very broadly to include anyone that's done interview and facilitation, to collaborate, to co-host, to host individually. I would also, now that we have a really fancy, nice YouTube video or YouTube channel that's also in the comments, I would like to post other people's work that's doing this to create opportunities for, you know, see people to see this work in one place and tune into the work that, you know, this pandemic has forced most things to be recorded, which is, it's got its pros and cons, but one of its pros is that we do have the opportunity as a capoeira community to preserve this knowledge and use it when the next horrible racist thing comes up. We'll have something. So that is the intention of this series, of this space, to archive and amplify. So if you like it, reach out to me, let me know what you think. If you hate it, also reach out to me, let me know what you think. I have a tough skin. And that's what we got for today. Again, Borboleta, thank you so much. Especially, you just had surgery yesterday and you still showed up and you still did the thing. And I'm just so grateful for you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for doing all this, because I know it's a huge mental task to put all this together. As a person who organizes myself, I understand it's hurting the cats, you know, it's a talent.
There are so many cats. There have been cats in this video. There will be cats in any future video with you. All right. I love you very much, and I will talk to you offline. Wait.
Okay.